Hi there, my name is Victoria Bowler, and today we are looking at a scope and sequence for elementary music. Our main goal today is to look at some ways to make a scope and sequence that is realistic and flexible and breathable. Before we dive in, there are two podcast episodes that I think can be really important as we jump in to this topic. One is where to start with summer music planning, and the other one is about this sense that we can sometimes get when we sit down to plan and we feel very distracted, or we feel like we might have writer's block, or that nothing that we put on the document is going to be good enough. Right? So I'll link those below if you are interested in listening, because I think they are a nice pairing with this conversation we're going to have today. All right, let's jump in. Our teaching year works in seasons. There's a rhythm to it, right? So a scope and sequence is a way that we can map out those different seasons and wrap our heads around what the year is going to be like. I think of it as a place for my brain to rest. So here's an example of a scope and sequence. This is from Inside the Planning Binder. This is second grade. It takes the scope of what we are learning in the year, this collection of concepts from that curriculum outline, if you remember us talking about that in a previous video, and it sequences them out throughout the year. What I love about a scope and sequence is that it budgets our time throughout the year. Have you ever been stressed right before a sharing because you felt like students had not had enough time to really work on the material and present it in front of an audience? Or have you ever felt discouraged that you didn't get to as much musical material as you had hoped to during the year? Or have you ever sat down to plan next week's class and realized that you don't even know what happened last week, let alone what you should be doing in this coming week or the week after that? I've experienced all of these. We probably all have. These have to do with how we budget our time. When we have a flexible and a realistic scope and sequence, we can look ahead at what concepts are coming up, and we can build in breathing room into the schedule. We can build in enough time for these musical ideas to really develop. If we want to go back to this idea of nature and working in seasons, and this document working in seasons, if we were to plant a vegetable garden, we probably would not pick up our seeds and then just dump everything in the ground all at once and expect to harvest it the very next day, right? Because things take time to grow. There's a pacing in nature. There's a natural rhythm. So if we want to harvest carrots in November, we need to work backwards and plant that seed a few months before, right? That's the magic of a scope and sequence for me. It frames our teaching year, again, just to keep this analogy going, it frames our teaching year into growing seasons. Let's talk about the mechanics of putting together a document like this. And let's look at some different templates that we might end up using along the way. The exact template that you use does not matter. This is the one that I've built. It's the one that I like. It has a weekly and a monthly version. But sketching all of this that we're talking about, sketching this all out on a piece of paper works just as well. So specifically, let's look at how to make this document flexible and realistic and breathable. The first piece here is pretty self-explanatory. You'll notice that I have the months of the year here, and then the date goes along this column. With our school calendar, we're going to plug in any important events, any important dates that are going to impact the music program. So things like when report cards are due, or if there are any days off, or holidays, or teacher work days, anything like that. I typically put these in the notes column if they're just things that I need to keep in mind, like when report card week is, or if there's a concert or a week that we don't have class. Anything like that gets blocked off in the schedule, or at least noted in the schedule. There are also some scheduling disruptions that we can expect. We just don't know when they are going to happen. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about making this document breathable. So if we know that we have a sharing event in the spring, but we're not exactly sure where in the spring that event is going to be, regardless of the exact date, we know we're going to want to block off a couple dates to get, or a couple weeks to get students ready for that sharing event. So even if we don't know exactly where we are plugging it in, we can still make room for it in our schedule. In my opinion, this document works best when it is flexible. One of the things that is going to impact how each of us constructs our scope and sequence has to do with how often we see students. And there's definitely a lot of diversity in scheduling for elementary music. This is not something that is standardized across the nation at all. So we might have music class once a week, we might have music class twice a week, we might be on a 6-day rotation or an 8-day rotation or a trimester or whatever it is. There are lots of different types of schedules that we're going to want to think about as we're constructing this document. So if there's a different music schedule to follow, like seeing students twice a week or maybe on a trimester system, we can make those documents as well. Here's an example of a twice a week document. And this one is a trimester system. You can see it's just color blocked in different colors to make it easier to see at a glance. Now you'll notice that these that we're looking at here, these are weekly layouts. Some of us really like the detail of a weekly layout. That's me. But for some of us, we want to zoom out and look at things a little bit more broadly, like month to month. So here's a monthly layout. The danger here, I think something worth saying, is that when you just look at the blank month, it looks like we have a lot of time, right? It's a whole month that we can devote to whatever conceptual understanding we're working on. But of course, we also know that within a month, let's imagine that we're seeing students 4 times. Within those 4 times, if we are sick and we have an assembly and we have a snow day, all of a sudden, a space that looks very big, a space that looks quite expansive, can get narrowed down into a very short amount of time very quickly, just a couple tweaks in the schedule. So with that in mind, my recommendation is to count up the number of lessons in each month. We don't need to cram a bunch of information in there. We don't need to cram a huge level of detail that we're not interested in. But we don't want to make it so general that it is equally not useful. Because this document doesn't help us at all if it is like an aspirational wish list of concepts, right? We want it to reflect what the year actually looks like. And that ties into the last piece that's really important to me as I am building these documents, and that is that this is a breathable flow to the year. You'll notice a few weeks marked off as breathing room, and that is for a couple different purposes. First, it acts as a buffer when just life happens and we get behind schedule. I'm going to put huge air quotes in behind schedule because, and I'll link another podcast about this below, if we are the ones building the schedule, if we are the ones building this scope and sequence, we don't ever have to get off schedule. We don't ever have to get behind because we're the ones making the schedule. We just adjust the document. So we know that life happens throughout the year. We're going to take a day off. We're going to have an extra assembly. We're going to have a snow day. So if I know that ahead of time, if I know that that's going to happen every single year, why not just build in breathing room into the document? Right? The other things that these weeks do, there might be times that we want to change things up in our teaching. I really like following a sequence of musical concepts. But there are also times that we want to do like a one-off lesson, or we want to try something that we saw in a workshop and maybe it doesn't necessarily fit into this sequence. Or maybe we as the teacher, one day we decide that we want to kind of take a break and have students do some coloring activities or some listening lessons or something that's a little bit less active for us. These breathing room weeks work rest into the schedule intentionally and not as an afterthought. So inside the planning binder, these are optional weeks for things like book lessons or instrumental work or listening lessons or review or sub plans or something like that. There's something happening there still, but it kind of serves as a like take what you need kind of week. Where does this material come from? I'm pulling these concepts from the curriculum outline that we talked about in a previous video. And there are lots of sources over there in that video if that's something that you are kind of interested in digging into. This is also where it's very helpful to have some sort of teaching process, some sort of teaching framework that we are following. And that helps us from feeling like we're spending our time looking for fun activities. And instead, it helps us make sure that each lesson is building on the previous experience so that the year is cohesive. And as we're plugging in musical content, it just helps to give us a very general idea, general guesstimate of how long students might take on each specific concept that we are kind of spiraling throughout this year. So now we're talking about plugging in the musical content itself. When we do that, one of the things that we find pretty quickly is that we have a lot of music to explore, and we probably don't have enough time to do everything that we want. We've already talked about, in one of the previous videos, we talked about Howard Gardner's statement that the enemy of understanding is coverage. And I think that applies again here. We don't want to just zoom through and skim through concepts to make sure that students can just read and write these rhythms, right? Or whatever musical material we're looking at. Reading and writing standardized Western notation is not the goal of our teaching, is it? So we want to make sure that we are taking enough time to really have these musical experiences build, to really give students enough time to sit with all of these musical expressions that we are exploring. And we want to go back to that gardening analogy earlier. We want to give students time to grow and build this understanding that they can transfer to a lot of new musical situations. When I look in a concept plan at all of the things that we are going to do with this musical information and all of the interactions that we want students to have and all of the creative opportunities that we're going to give students and all of the standards and all of the really big picture ideas, that's going to take some time. So coverage can't be the goal. So we have this document set up, the bones are there, but we're still working on putting this musical content in. So let's think about how we might plan flexibly when it's time to put the actual teaching material in. Because if we try to plan out every single little thing and put in a lot of detail, that's when we really get into the weeds and we feel like bogged down by all of these tiny decisions. That can feel discouraging. And it doesn't really serve the purpose of this document anyway, right? Because we want this to be a realistic look at our year. So let's think through some different strategies that we might use when we're putting together this document so it has an appropriate amount of information and flexibility. One strategy that I like to use is to plan out every single thing in detail. What weeks we are going to focus on what concepts. And then I erase the entire second semester. So this helps me budget out my time so that I know that I can technically get to everything that I think I can. But when we hit winter break, I can go back in and plan out the rest of the year. Another strategy is to write down the big mile markers of the curriculum, like the presentation lessons if we are wearing a Kodai hat. So for this, we're going to make a guesstimate of how long preparation might take. So let's imagine 3-ish lessons, right, depending on the concept. And we're going to write in that presentation moment. And this way, if something changes, we're not changing the entire document, right? We're just moving around a few cells. And then throughout the year, we'll just keep an eye on this document to know what concepts are coming up so we can start working on songs or skills or anything like that that we might need later. And again, this is where having a framework for teaching, a sequence for teaching, can really come in handy. And then the last strategy we've already talked about. We might just want to write down the big ideas for the month. And like we talked about earlier, we're going to want to glance at how many teaching weeks we can actually get into that month so that the schedule here stays realistic. Some of the main concerns that we have about building a scope and sequence have to do with planning things too tightly and making sure that there's room to respond to what students need in the moment. And I think both of those are absolutely valid, and those are things that I think about as well. So let's talk about both of them briefly. One of the main concerns that we have about long-range planning is that we don't want to plan everything out and then just watch it become completely irrelevant when one small thing changes in our year, right? And then we have to replan the entire document. And I've been there before. That absolutely stinks, and it's no fun at all. In my opinion, I think this normally happens because we have crammed too much into each week or each month. We've put too many concepts in. So even though we could hypothetically get to everything on the page, on paper it works, right? But we know that that's not realistic. This is more of an aspirational plan. It's more of a wish list, all the things that we wish we could do if there were never any absences or any scheduling disruptions or any new ideas from a workshop that we wanted to try in the middle of the year. So this is one reason that it can be nice to just fill in the big ideas with some sort of, with some of those tactics that we talked about earlier, planning the whole year and then erasing half of it, or only writing in the presentation lessons, or only using the monthly view. Next, I don't want to plan because I want to respond to students in the moment. The other concern we have, and I have this concern too, is that if we plan everything out so the year is cohesive and it makes sense from a sequencing standpoint, then we're not really setting ourselves up to be responsive to students' needs in the moment. And there's this fear, there's a jump then, that if something happens in the classroom that's not on the document, we're going to cover our eyes, we're going to cover our ears, and la 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 la, we're not going to listen to students and only follow the document. And of course, that's not our only option, and that's also not the approach that many of us would take given the choice. We don't follow the document, we follow the students. And this is another place where the actual teaching process itself can be very helpful to think through, because if we are purposefully making room in our concept plans for student choice and collaboration and assessment, we're going to have lots of opportunities to get feedback from the other musicians in the room. Now, there's a lot missing here, just like we talked about with the curriculum outline. There's a lot that this document doesn't show. In terms of this schedule itself, in terms of the document itself, there are things that we are going to do in the year, like repertoire or activities or books or even standards or big macro concepts. There are things that we're going to do and address in the year that are not here in this scope and sequence. And that's not because I don't think they should go here. I definitely think they can. It's just because this version of a scope and sequence shows us where the concepts are going to be consciously highlighted. It doesn't show how students are going to learn those concepts. It doesn't show what students are going to do with those concepts. The reasons I don't add all of those really important things here are, number one, it's just a level of detail that I don't really prefer to have. I love having a plan. I have a lot of peace when I can see a good plan laid out. But like we've talked about, it's also important to me that the plan is flexible. So I don't want to fill this in too much. I just want it to serve the purpose of being a place for my brain to rest. And the other reason is that I know that in our concept plans, I'm going to include all of those really important things, right? Like all of the doings of the lessons, the repertoire and the activities and the standards and everything like that. So this document is not the place where those things need to be housed primarily. Now, that said, there's a reason that these documents are editable. We can all make our own scope and sequence documents that reflect our situations, and none of them are going to look exactly the same. And probably just with ourselves, we won't even have the exact same scope and sequence, the exact same schedule year to year. And that's good, because none of us as teachers are standardized, and we certainly don't teach any standardized students. Today we've looked at some ways to make a scope and sequence that is realistic and flexible and breathable. When we plan our years this way, it certainly takes some time on the front end to get everything set up. But if we do this part well, we've mapped out our whole year and we've taken care of so many of the decisions that we're going to encounter later. Again, I like this document because it gives my brain a place to rest. We've thought ahead to all of the different seasons in our year. We've thought ahead to the natural rhythms in our teaching. So that is our scope and sequence. If you have a question or a comment on this video, I would love to hear from you. You can drop a comment below. You can find me on Instagram. I am at Victoria Bowler, or you can shoot me an email, victoria@victoriabowler.com. Thank you so much for watching and happy teaching.